Hello again. I want to speak today about one of Britain's favourite myths, in fact probably the favourite myth of Britain, which is the Battle of Britain. It ties in with two other myths, the Blitz and the evacuation of Dunkirk, and these things altogether make up a myth cycle which is absolutely beloved of the British. As we've received it, the story of the Battle of Britain is roughly as follows. After the fall of France in the early summer of 1940, Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany. Most of Europe had fallen, and Hitler knew that he had to crush Britain so that he could rule the whole continent. Before he could invade Britain, he had to destroy our air force, and so the Luftwaffe, the German air force, came over to Britain and tried to attack all our airfields and destroy our aircraft. British officers of the RAF, the sort of people we're all familiar with from various Hollywood films, fought tenaciously against Germany, and in the end we managed to beat them off. The Germans realised that they couldn't tackle Britain and invade us, so they turned their attentions instead to Russia. British pluck had beaten German might. It's hard to know where to begin with a pack of fairy stories like this. We might start by asking about the extent to which a nation that rules a quarter of the Earth's land surface can really be said to stand alone against a country like Germany, which had hardly any overseas possessions at all. Britain had the resources of Canada, Australia, New Zealand, India, half of Africa, possessions in the Caribbean, South America. It's rather odd to portray such a country as the underdog, as a little David standing against a mighty Goliath. Looking now at those gallant British officers who were flying the aeroplanes that defended Britain, we all have an image, an archetype of the well-spoken officer type who was a pilot in the Battle of Britain. This is very misleading because fewer than a half of the pilots at that time were actually British officers. A fifth of them were foreigners, South Africans, French, Poles and so on. The greatest ace of the Battle of Britain was a Czech pilot. The British National Party used the image of a Spitfire in an election campaign in 2009. Unluckily for the BNP, who were campaigning against immigration from Eastern Europe, the Spitfire they chose for their poster was one belonging to the 303 Squadron, which was piloted by a Pole. Hundreds of Polish pilots fought in the Battle of Britain. Apart from the foreigners, about a third of the pilots in the Battle of Britain were working class sergeants and flight sergeants. It's a little odd for us to square this with the idea that we have, or the archetype we have, of the British officer with his handlebar moustache. As I say, over half the pilots in the Battle of Britain were actually foreign or working class. Far from being the underdog, the British had a number of very strong advantages during the Battle of Britain that we tend to forget about these days. First of these was a radar system, which meant that we knew immediately when German aeroplanes were heading across the English Channel. The system, known as Chain Home, had been built during the 1930s. It gave Britain a tremendous edge when it came to aerial warfare. Another factor is the ability to land and refuel and stock up on ammunition. The RAF were fighting on home ground. By the time the German aeroplane had reached the home counties around London, they only had 10 or 15 minutes flying time before they had to return to France to refuel. This was another great edge the British had. They had plenty of fuel, plenty of ammunition. If they were shot down, they were likely enough to land by parachute and be able to fly another day, whereas German pilots ended up on enemy territory. Ultimately, the Battle of Britain turned into a war of attrition, in which both sides were trying to wear down the other and cause them to run out of aircraft and men. Here again, the British had a very strong advantage that no one ever talks of these days. Hitler was already planning the invasion of Germany in 1940. He had it planned for the following year, which meant that German armaments factories were not focusing on aircraft at all. They were focusing on armour, tanks and so on, which would be useful for a land invasion of the Soviet Union. This meant that when they lost an aeroplane, they were less able to replace it than the British were. Looking at statistics for aircraft production from the summer of 1940 onward, we can see what I mean by this. In June, the British produced 446 aircraft. Germany produced only 164. In July, the British produced 496 to Germany's 220. In August, 476, Germany 173. September, 467 to 218. By October, the British were producing 469 aeroplanes for Germany's 144. There's no prizes really for guessing who's going to win a war of attrition when you look at statistics like that. The whole idea about Britain fighting desperately with its back against the wall is a nonsense. The David and Goliath myth that we love so much is complete rubbish. I can't leave the subject without mentioning the bombing of Britain, which began in the Blitz in September 1940. Here again, we've been very, very badly misled. The idea is that after the Germans found they couldn't defeat us militarily by attacking British airfields and fighting with the RAF, they, in a very cowardly way, decided to turn on our cities and begin bombing civilians instead, which was a dreadful thing to do. Again, this is not really true at all. The British began bombing Germany a long time before Germany began bombing British cities. To call the Blitz and the Battle of Britain and this whole sequence of events which we think we know a myth is probably a little too charitable, because it's really a downright falsehood. The German raids on British airfields began in August 1940, and the Blitz proper on our British cities began in September 1940. In this scenario, the Germans began bombing Britain, and then years later we retaliated by attacking Germany and bombing their cities. It jolly well served them right. What actually happened was this. On the night of May the 11th, 1940, 4 months before the Blitz, 36 British bombers attacked the German city of Mönchengladbach. 4 days later, 100 bombers struck at the Ruhr, the heart of Germany's industrial might. On May the 17th, 130 British bombers struck Hamburg, not only the railway lines there and the oil tanks, but also the city centre, where 34 people were killed. Hardly anybody today remembers that it was Britain which first attacked Germany and began bombing its cities rather than the other way round. That's because part of the myth is to provide justification for the British actions a few years later when they bombed places like Dresden and killed hundreds of thousands of people. It was done justified on the grounds that because Germany had begun the bombing of cities, they had sown the wind and they were reaping the whirlwind, and that it served them right because they started it. It's not true. It was Britain that first attacked Germany.